Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Love Well podcast. My name is Marlene,
And my name is Anna.
and we're so glad that you joined back in with us. And this week we have a very special guest. As you guys know, we have been talking about immigration, and we have been bringing guests that have shared their stories, their unique stories of immigration. And today we get to hear a different perspective, one that we wholeheartedly believe is so important. And as we continue to have different layers and just perspectives and experiences about immigrating and what does that mean and what is the impact. Yeah, we have a special guest and a different perspective. So Anna, please, can you tell us a little bit more about our guest?
Yes, I am so excited because I have known Jess now like for over 6, 7 years. She came to Charlotte from Chicago with her family, and I have loved every bit of being able to be friends and be a part of her family. I feel like I'm adopted into her family. We're basically
Absolutely.
sisters. Yes, so this is my sister Jessica.
Mm.
I call her Jess, but she is an incredible woman of faith, and I just love her and her family so much. So, Jess, will you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am very excited to be here today. For everyone that does not know me, because it's my first time on the podcast, my name is Jessica Colazo, and like Anna said, I'm from Chicago, Illinois, and I am Puerto Rican, right? And so my story, as my Len alluded to, is a little bit different because Puerto Ricans are not immigrants, right? We are part of the United States and we are US citizens, but we have such a very different story.
Yeah.
And most people don't really understand our story, right? And don't even understand where we come from. And just even moving, for example, from Chicago to Charlotte, right? Huge difference, in being in a community where I was surrounded by Latino people always to a community where, frankly, I was starting to lose my Spanish because you don't practice it as much, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm really excited to be able to chat with you girls and just talk about life and talk about what it means to love different people really well.
Mm.
Yay, we're so excited to have you on. Okay, so will you tell us a little bit? You mentioned you came from Chicago a few years ago, but when did your family move to the US from Puerto Rico? And can you share a little bit about the impact that had? Because, like you said, it's a different perspective, it's a different
Mm.
experience.
Yeah, so my mom was 16 when she moved from Puerto Rico to New York, and in general in that time that was really the move you made. Most people, it's why New York is such a big hub for Puerto Rican families,
Yeah.
moved at that time. My uncle moved first. So my mom has five siblings, and so the oldest one moved first, and then he was able to help everyone come over, and they were very poor in Puerto Rico. And so there was not much work and there was not much for them to be able to do there to help them get a better life. And so when my uncle moved, he found a place, he worked, he was able to, send for them. But then my mom, when she came, she basically had to start working. Right. And she had been working in Puerto Rico, so she only attended high school through ninth grade, right? And then after that, it was time to work, right? Because they just needed it. And so when they moved to New York, her and my aunt would actually put makeup on and get dressed up and look older so that way they wouldn't get questioned when they would work in the factories so that they'd be able to, help bring money home.
Wow.
Wow.
Hmm.
Wow. That's there's a million questions that come to mind. Um how did that personally, I mean, hearing that, how did that affect you? How did that change your perspective? Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
It was very interesting because I
Mhm.
think all it did for us is just instill really hard work ethic in us, right?
Mm,
Yeah.
Like jokingly good and bad, right? I'm
yeah.
a workaholic. And so I'm really dedicated to all of what I do. I'm an all-in kind of person. And
Yeah.
so, and it doesn't matter if it's a volunteer role, it doesn't matter if it's my 9 to 5 role. I am going to give you all of who I am and everything that I do. And I think that's just where that came from.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Could I ask you something? Because I've had conversations with also other other close friends that are second generation, and this might be too personal, but feel free to not have to answer. But do you feel like it's a responsibility or like a burden for you to have to like work harder, or something that because you carry
Mm.
in that resilience,
Hmm.
obviously like the background from your family being poor, but yet everything they had to do in order to provide and the
Hmm.
sacrifices, right? Even like that's incredible that they had to put on makeup and change their appearance to not be questioned.
Hmm.
Do you feel any type of responsibility or burden with that? Just
I,
curious. Just curious.
I think subconsciously
Mm-hmm.
there's always a something to prove,
Mm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's kind of one of those things that I
Yeah.
carry, because I have seen the difficulties, that they've encountered. Like to this day, my mom can absolutely hold a conversation in English perfectly fine. She's still self-conscious about it, right? There's still that
Yeah.
part of it that you can tell because of the experiences that she's been through, that she still tends to feel self-conscious about, is she saying it right, and wanting to be able to be understood well, right? And so I think subconsciously, just because of even just other factors in my upbringing and how things had to happen for me, that I think I carry a little bit of a something to prove, right?
Yeah.
Like I am good enough. You're going to know I'm good enough, and I'm going to prove I'm good enough, kind of
Yeah.
thing. And those are things that I will say to the audience. I have had to do a lot of work with the Lord on, right?
Yeah.
Because it's a different form of pride. And so
Yeah.
while we may not identify it as that, we may not want to talk about it as that, it is, right? And so you would have asked me years ago, are you a prideful person? I would say no. I mean, honestly,
Mm.
I'll clean a toilet, I'll do whatever. I'm like servant hearted. I'll, serve wherever I need to, do whatever I need to do. But that's not where the pride comes in. It's not I'm better than that. The pride that I feel like myself and potentially a lot of second generation Latinos have carried with them is the I am good enough, and I'm going to
Mm.
show you I'm good enough. And
Oof.
so I think that's something, the
Yeah.
tension that's
Yeah.
managed.
Yeah. No,
Mm.
thank you for sharing so vulnerably too. And wow, yeah, yeah. I was just very curious because it is a conversation, that it is important. It's a different kind of responsibility, but wow, the perspective that you just brought in, it's very, very insightful. Very, very insightful. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for
Yeah.
sharing.
Yeah. I feel like okay, so you mentioned, I mean, your mom came here when she was what, a teenager. And so I think one of the things that we've also been, Marlon made a point on our last episode that I thought was great, that we like to I guess we kind of like to get these perspectives for the sense of we want to hear like the hardships, we want to hear the good stuff because it's not exclusively good and it's not exclusively bad, right? And everyone's
Yeah.
perspective is different. So, what are some of the hardships that you felt like you and your family faced after, you know, while you were growing up as a second generation, like you
Mm. Yeah.
mentioned, um, going to places where maybe when your mom wasn't able to speak English, you felt like you had to step in. Can you give us like some examples of what that was like
Yeah.
for you and your family?
Yeah, and it's just very interesting, right? Because growing up, like if you would have asked me, did I grow up poor? I wouldn't have said yes, because to me, I had everything I needed, right? And so I
Mm,
think our family did a really good job of every one of our needs were met. I think it wasn't until I was older that I realized how hard it was, in that, right? Like for me, it was very normal to go to the government housing office and help my mom fill out paperwork. That was just part of,
mm,
or to go to the government offices to help with, food stamps and things like that, right?
Yeah.
And so I think those were things that were just part of, I knew there were assistance and I knew there were things like that, but it was just kind of very, very natural
Mhm.
for me in growing up of, hey, we need, here's where we go and we find, right? And
Mm.
so for my mom, like I said, even though she, I mean, I say she couldn't defend herself really easily, in English. Um, I did, growing up, spend most of my time going to parent teacher conferences and translating and doing things like that. And I do have older siblings, but the dynamic of our family is they're much older than I am. So I'm basically what I call an only child with siblings, right? So where
Yeah.
they were out of the house already when I was, really in my formative years growing up. And so in that scenario where in other families, the oldest is probably the one that would have been doing a lot of these things,
Yeah.
right? I
Mhm.
was doing it because she was out the house already and, with her family. So yeah, it's just a very
Mhm.
different dynamic in what was normal for me and
Mhm.
what life was like. And none of it, like you said, I mean, I don't consider any of it bad. And it wasn't
Yeah.
bad and it wasn't good. It was different and it was hard at times. And at times it wasn't. And so it's just kind of the way that I am. And I think some of that I will say is personality driven too.
Yeah.
Like my personality is very different.
Mm.
And so I don't tend to look at glass half empty. I'm not a glass half full either. Here's what we have, and
Realist.
like
Mhm.
here's what we're moving forward with, So it's just very different, I think, and it all depends on your perspective, how you're willing to look at things, how you're willing
Mhm.
to associate with things. I'm also not a I've hated labels my entire life, right? So I never
Mhm.
want to be labeled something. So that means I can't give myself that label that I don't want somebody else to give me, right?
Mhm.
And so, but on the flip side of that, I think because I function in that way, it took me a long time to really process and really acknowledge, oh, these are the things that I experienced. And it's
Mm.
not a label, it's a reality, right? We
Wow.
Mm.
were poor. That's a reality of it, right?
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
we were blessed and we were taken care of
Mm.
always and we were provided
Yeah.
for, right? So both are realities that can be true and exist at the same time.
That's good.
Multiple things can be true at once, right?
Yep.
Mhm.
Oh
Hmm.
man, no, yeah. Thank you for sharing that, and going into detail with your experience. We always make it a point. Yes, there are hardships, and thank you for bringing up the perspective because it is truly about perspective. Like you don't know what you don't know until you step outside or you get to a point in life and you get to see back and kind of like from that third perspective of like, oh yeah, this is what we experienced. This is what it was. It's not exclusively bad, but there are good things that we can get out of that. So
Hmm.
thank you for sharing that. What are some things that you would say, and I want to ask this, like thinking about the impact of moving and immigrating to a new place, right? Even though Puerto Rico is part of the US, there is still, I know my Puerto Rican friends are absolutely proud of their culture, and of their
Hmm.
language. Um, what is something that you're thankful for that maybe life would have looked different if your mom would have chosen to stay in Puerto Rico and not move to the
Hmm.
US? So there's the hardships that come with that, right? Moving to a new place, adjusting to the culture, adjusting to the language. However, how have you seen God move in the ways that now you can look back and
Hmm.
say, I'm thankful that because of immigration, because of them moving here, I am
Hmm.
able to have a different life. Could you share some of that with us?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the resources in general, I mean, I think
Mm.
that anyone who cares to know can easily find out the state of how things are in Puerto Rico, right?
Mm.
You know, healthcare, job opportunities, all the things, they're not in abundance there, right? And
Mm.
so while we love our island, right? And we love everything about that,
Mm.
I don't know
Yeah.
that my life would look the way it looks like if I,
Mm.
wouldn't have been born here, right?
Mm.
Like for my dad's, like from on my dad's side, I think we were some of the first ones to go to college, right?
Mm.
Like that was one
Yeah.
of those things that he instilled in us. It was school, 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 school. It did not matter anything else. It was school was our priority, and we were going to go to school because they understood the weight of that, right? They
Mm. Yeah.
understood
Mhm.
that education brings opportunities, right?
Yeah.
And staying, I don't know what it would have been, right? There are lots of people that stayed, and our doctors and our humanitarians and social workers and all the things, right? But for where the state of our family was, I don't know that it would have turned out in that way, right? Like if they were barely surviving then,
Yeah.
would that have been our story? We don't
Mm.
know. What I do
Yeah.
know is that, me and my sisters all have great careers.
Mm.
All of our kids, are have thriving opportunities as well. My oldest son is in college, right? I have a younger one who's in high school. We were
I know it's
just
hard to
talking to
believe she
mom.
has a kid in
Yeah.
college, just so you know.
That's
Absolutely. Yes.
I'm like, it's one
She
of my
doesn't look
secrets, I
like
guess
it
to
at
say.
all.
Yes.
You know,
I love
it's
it.
definitely one of my well kept secrets, but
Yes.
it's one of those things where, like we were talking about my mom's legacy, right? So if I look at
Mm.
my mom's legacy, take, taking aside my nephew, my one nephew, my son, and my two sons, who are still high school, college age, right? And working through that, every one of my other nieces and nephews are all in the service somehow. Police officers, firefighters, military, and so
Yeah.
would that be the legacy? We don't
Mm.
know, but we do know that they are, and they have these abilities because of the
Mm.
opportunities we had, by being here, and so
Yeah.
we don't take for granted the fact
Yeah.
that, as tumultuous as the country can be at times, there is
Mm.
an abundance of opportunity here
Mhm.
that you don't have in many other countries and many other
Yeah.
places.
Yeah.
And so we enjoy that, right? And we celebrate that, and we know that, kind of the sky's the limit. As much
Mhm.
as we're willing to put in, we're able to get, right? And you don't get that in every single place
Yeah.
that you may be your origin.
Yeah.
Mhm. That's true.
That's so good.
Okay, I just thought of something kind of it's what we were just talking about. It's a little bit off topic. But um I mean, just imagining, okay, like you said, you're second generation, so you're growing up here, but your parents are from Puerto Rico, so another country. Like Marlon noted, there's the culture difference, there's the language barrier, like all of these things. So, did you find it to be like a struggle at all to feel like you fit in one way or another? Because you're
Mhm.
kind of like, hey, I'm from here, these are the opportunities that I,
Mhm.
perceive, but then also seeing the side of like, with your mom and your family, and how did you learn to bridge that gap and kind of become like a bridge builder within two different cultures, to where you're still proud of your heritage and you're still proud of exactly
Mhm.
where what the hard work and the resilience and the things that your dad and your mom instilled in you, but you're still able to feel like, hey, like I belong here. This is
Mm.
also just as much
Yep.
mine. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And it's very interesting because I would say, and everybody's different. For
Mm-hmm.
us, it's very different, that kind of story, because again, New York was little Puerto Rico, right? And then you go to
Yeah.
Chicago and everybody around us was Hispanic
Mm-hmm.
Latino, right? And
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
so we didn't feel like we missed, right? Like our grocery stores had all the
Mhm.
things, right? Like here in
Yeah.
Charlotte, I have to go and drive
Look
like
for
20
it.
minutes to get to the to look for, the things. But the corner store by the house had
Mhm.
plantains, and you
Yeah.
get your avocados, really easily,
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
so
Mhm.
from a culture standpoint, and especially like Mylene said, Puerto Ricans are very proud people. They will fly up their flag real quick wherever they go, and so
Yeah. Mhm.
you
And
just
I
see
love
it
it.
all
Yeah.
around, right?
I love it. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I didn't, for me, I
Mm.
guess I never felt that, right? Like
Mhm.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
grew up feeling I was just as much Puerto Rican as I was American, right? There
Mm,
wasn't this like separation for me.
mm,
Honestly, it wasn't until a few years ago I had to ask my sister what was my first language, because I always
mm,
assumed my first language was English, because I
mhm.
went straight into kindergarten. I went to an English class. I never was in a Spanish speaking class, but Spanish is technically my first language. So I learned
Yeah.
to speak Spanish first. But because
Hmm.
when I was a toddler, my sisters were in high school, right? They spoke to me in English while my
Mm,
parents spoke to me in Spanish. And so I just always grew up immersed in both worlds.
Hmm.
So there was never to me like the bridge to that I had to help gap that bridge until I would say I probably moved to Charlotte, because again, in Charlotte, I didn't
yeah.
see that as much, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so here I think is where I've had to be a little bit more of like, no, this is who I am and this is what this is and this is what, like here's some of our food and here, things like that. Cause
Hmm.
Yeah.
in Chicago, I mean, I can go anywhere and I can get an acapurria, right? I can't do
Yeah.
that here. I'd have to make it
Yeah.
myself if I want, and
Mm,
it's so
yeah.
it's one of those things where it I think geographically
Yeah.
the experience of a Puerto Rican will be very different depending on where they move to, right?
Hmm.
Yeah.
So a Puerto Rican that moves to North Carolina straight from Puerto Rico is probably going to have a hugely different experience than like in my case where I was born and raised in Chicago. And I mean, one of the streets in Chicago, it's like we have a park called Humboldt Park. It's like the main Puerto Rican hub, right? There's two big
Mm,
flags on each side of the street. I mean, that go from one
mm,
side of the street to the other. So your culture is there.
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. That's
No, that
neat.
is fascinating. And I think what you
Yeah.
said geographically, and it's been interesting to also hear from our guests too, depending on where they moved in the US,
Hmm.
their experiences varied,
Right.
where the
Hmm.
less diverse we saw, like we've seen the stories, the less diverse it is, the harder, the more hardships, like and more layers come with their experience.
Hmm.
So thank you for sharing that. And it's a very interesting perspective, because I do talk about a lot with people in second generation about being bicultural, right? And what how does it feel? And honestly,
Right.
now that when you said geographically, I can see now with specific friends why it was the way that it was. And I have another friend, I don't know if you guys call yourself New Yorkers, right? Am I
Oh
correct with
yeah.
that?
Well, I can't claim that title because I was born in Chicago, but my
That's right.
sisters
That's right.
who were born in
But
New York are 100% New Yorkers, right? Because they're born in New York and they're Puerto Rican. So yeah, yeah, 100%.
yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah, yeah. And oftentimes, depending where they were, like my friends that grew up around more in the southern part, or here in North Carolina, they do have that feeling of like ni de aquí ni de allá, of like
Yeah.
I'm not even from here or even from there.
Right.
Mhm.
And sometimes it even happens within like our own community as well,
Mhm.
and even other immigrants that have come and they're like, oh, but you're not really, because you grew up in the US and you don't know the
Right.
struggle, and
Hmm.
conversations like that. So thank you for sharing your perspective, because I think it gives me also a lot of insight, of like, yeah,
Yeah.
every experience is different, and it makes so much sense, like geographically, why you didn't have that distinction, because your
Mhm.
context was full of it. So you had a piece of home literally everywhere
Literally.
on the streets, like wherever you went. So that's really cool that you were able to experience that piece of home, and where you had those two things that made and really spoke into who you are today. Can I ask you, just because I'm curious about as well, how do you carry that? Okay, so in North Carolina, it's been very different experience, right? You've had to, like you
Mhm.
said it. If I want to have it, I have to make it myself. And you do have kids. How has
Hmm.
that impacted your family and your kids? Like, how have you, talked about culture and within your family? Would love to hear that. As I also I'm part of a multi-ethnic marriage, and that these are conversations that we consistently have. But since you already have, kids and your family, would
Hmm.
love to hear your perspective of like how do you talk about culture with your kids? How has that impacted your family?
Mhm.
Well, it's really interesting because something going back to what you said, ni de aquí ni de allá, right? It's,
Yeah.
neither here nor there. That's very interesting because even in, like, if you take how my husband grew up versus how I grew up, right? We're both
Yeah.
Puerto Rican.
Okay.
He didn't grow up speaking Spanish. I grew up speaking Spanish,
Mm,
right?
mm,
And
yeah.
so even that small of a thing is a huge thing, right?
Oh, it is.
Because
It is.
I
It is.
still remember when I first met his parents, it was like, oh, she knows the lingo. She knows the, like she
Yeah.
gets it, right?
Yeah.
Whereas like we'd have conversations sometimes and my husband would be like, what are y'all saying? What are you talking about, right?
Mm,
Um,
yeah.
I'll go as far as even to saying church, for example, right? I grew up in a Spanish
Mhm.
speaking church. He did
Mm.
not, right? I
Very
grew
different
up
experience.
Christian, he
Yeah.
grew up Catholic, right? Very different,
Mm, yeah.
upbringings. Well, when we started, going to church together, for him, it was like, I can't go to a Spanish church. I feel like it's my aunts are yelling at me because the only time he heard
Mm,
Spanish was when somebody was yelling at him, right?
wow. Yeah.
And so
Yeah.
when you think those dynamics growing up and then trying to bring it into this generation,
Mm,
it's been hard actually, because,
yeah.
for example, my mom was the primary caregiver for all her grandchildren.
Mm,
But for
mm,
whatever reason, instead of speaking Spanish to them, she spoke English to them, right? Because
mm.
she's practicing her English, right?
Yeah.
So they're
Yeah.
not speaking Spanish. So while
Mm,
they're hearing it and they're kind of familiar with it, I
yeah.
actually had to have both my kids take Spanish in school so
Mm,
that they can really understand the language. And then the other component to that, and I don't know if it's like this for you, Marlene, but for me,
mm,
because I was so integrated in
mm.
my culture and in my language and everything, it's almost like anybody my age and younger, I speak English to automatically. Anyone older, it's like my brain flips and
Yeah.
the conversation goes immediately to Spanish, right? Because in growing up, I know
Yeah.
everybody older than me, like we had to speak Spanish to them and conversate with them in
Yeah.
Spanish. But my cousins, my sisters, my friends, even though a lot of them knew Spanish, we just spoke English to each other because that
Yeah.
was our language to speak, right? So then fast forward, it's not natural for me to speak to my kids in
Mm,
Spanish
mm,
because of that like switch that I have that I
yeah.
didn't even know, kind of, it just is there, right? And so we've
Yeah.
had to be very intentional. I mean, food wise, they're very integrated because,
Yeah.
it's one of those things, right? Like, I think I
Yeah.
even got to the point where I was like, I boycotted rice and beans for a while because I'm like, I'm done, people, I'm done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
but but for everything else, like the language and things like that,
Mm,
it's just been very interesting dynamic because you
yeah.
do have to be really intentional about it if you want it to continue. So now my
Yeah.
oldest, he is fully conversational in Spanish
Mm,
now. And
mhm.
it was like it took him being in school and the conversation starting there for then us to continue them here. But like my husband, for example, the reason he speaks as much Spanish as he does now was because when we got together, he had to speak to my mom in Spanish. And then
Mm,
for several years he worked at a factory where he worked at a bread factory, and the factory was all Spanish speaking, and most of them
yeah.
were immigrants
Yep.
and most of them were from Central South
Yep.
America, right? And so
Yeah.
he had to learn. And so then
Mm,
going back to your ni de aquí ni de allá, right? When you speak
mhm.
to other people of Latin cultures, they
Yep.
tend to judge your Spanish, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Especially for Caribbean people, right? So especially for
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans, Cubans, and
Yep.
Dominicans, we get kind of blasted like that's not proper Spanish, right? And I'm
Yeah.
like, well,
Mhm.
it actually is. It's just a different dialect because we don't tell people from
Yeah.
Australia and we don't tell people from Britain that their
Yep.
English is wrong, or
Right.
they don't tell us our English is incorrect, right? It's a different
Mm,
dialect, right? And so
mhm. Yeah.
I've had to navigate every one of those components because as my kids learn Spanish, I have to teach them, well, this is how we say it in Puerto Rico, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then as I navigate with people here too, it's like, well, like how do you say that in Spanish? I'm like, we kind of don't. We just make up our own word for that one, like because we just do sometimes. They're just words that we make up.
Yeah. That's language. Yeah, that's language.
Right.
It's
And
very much so
thing
context too. Hmm.
and
Mm.
Spanglish is very much a thing, I feel like, with our generation, because we're so
Mm.
integrated in the English and Spanish
Yeah,
that speaking Spanglish is a legitimate thing because of just how our brain gets wired, right? I
yeah,
was recently at an event for one of my kids' school, and this translator didn't show up, and so I ended up translating, right? And so even in the moment, I was like, how do you say this? How do you say this? And you're trying to think through it because you're so conditioned, right?
yeah,
Whereas on the flip side, again, when I started going to an English church versus Spanish church, I had to translate everything in my head because I knew the scripture, I knew the context, but I knew it in Spanish. So now I had to
yep.
translate it into English. So there's almost this constant thing happening in your brain
Mm.
that then you're trying to be able to show your family, like I'm showing my kids, like, hey, this is how this is, it's just one big mashup of things.
I'm sure. Oh my goodness.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no,
That's a
thank
lot.
you for sharing. Yeah, that no, but that's wonderful. I'm like, I just got to peek
Mm.
into, it is a hard thing, and from the families too, especially those who have mixed, come from mixed like backgrounds. The language thing is intentionality, and also sometimes the kids don't want to even speak it, and then that's something that John and I talk about. We're like, oh, I hope our kids are wanting to. There's
Mhm.
this couple that we know. They both, their first language is Spanish, and they speak English, but it's very limited. However, all of their kids were born here, and the oldest is able to speak well, but as they get younger and younger, they're losing the language. So their two
Mm.
youngest, like, understand it fully, but they always answer back in English. So it's just like this. Every every family is different, and the approach on how you keep the culture alive, is just very interesting to see how everyone approaches that. So thank you for sharing. Just what goes inside
Yes.
your brain. It is a lot. It is a lot. It is a lot, but I think it goes back to how intentional you are, how you present it to your children. And I love that they're able to. Food is a big thing for us culturally. It's a way that it unites, a way that we can show up with our culture, and pass it down, for sure, for sure. So
Well, and
thank
I
you for
think
sharing that.
it's even important for our friends who have never experienced what it is to have moved, migrated, depending on, your
Yeah,
background, culture,
yeah,
whatever the case may
yeah,
be, to even understand the complexities that go on
mm,
in your friends' brains, right? Like
yeah.
someone who's just born in the United States, right? And
Mhm.
never have dealt with any cultural things, you may not
Yeah.
Yeah.
understand, like, wow, all of that is what's going through their brain sometimes, right?
Mhm.
So even I think even professionally, when I
Mm,
write some things, right?
mm,
I write in a way that sometimes I rewrite because
mm,
the way it comes out is almost a translated version, and then I have to edit it to be the
mm.
correct English, version so that it's proper. So
Yeah,
in many ways people think like, oh, it's you don't speak proper English. No, it's not that. It's that we're
yeah.
literally going through something in our brains and trying to translate it all from a comprehension standpoint, and other people don't have to deal with that.
Yeah.
I
I've
agree
always
100%.
I've
Yes.
always been fascinated just with any language that like bilingual. Like I just don't
Mhm.
understand how you flip so quick to be able to talk in a different language with different rules and different ways of like conjugating things. Like English is a hard language, you know?
Hmm.
But then to have another language on top of that, like you were saying, Spanglish is a real thing because that
It
would be
is.
like
Oh, it's a real thing.
it would just be like merging two different completely different things. Like, no
Hmm.
wonder. But I will
Yeah.
say, Jess and I, like I said, have been friends for a while now. But I love that her like way that she lives her life is like her house is an open door. She loves having people
Mhm.
over. She loves hosting people, and she loves being able to give give a piece of her culture to all her friends, which I just love because I never go there and feel like, oh, I'm like intruding. it's always like so
Mm,
hospitable. And I know that's that cultural, that relational side of your culture that you
Hmm.
love to show. And I just think that's so neat how even if you're, you're instilling it with your kids too, but you're also showing your friends like a piece of that too.
Hmm.
So I,
Yeah.
I love
Thank
that.
you.
I love that.
Okay,
Hmm.
I think we have one more question for you, Jess. And I'm gonna
Mhm.
kind of summarize this a little bit because we tend to ask our guests at the last part of the episodes is how can we love people better? How can we love people well? But considering your situation, what you spoke about with, being always immersed within both cultures, what would you
Yeah.
want to say to people that maybe don't have that situation and maybe do feel like I can't say it because I'm going to butcher what you guys said in Spanish, but the neither here, neither there feeling a
Hmm.
lot of
Yep.
times of like, I don't know how to navigate this as well. What would you
Mm,
say to them?
First and foremost, don't make assumptions, right? I think when you make assumptions, that's where things become really then hurtful or offensive, or
mm,
like then you get even standoffish, right? Where because then what happens is when you make an assumption about someone from a different background, a different culture, a different dynamic, you're
yeah.
not giving them the credit that they deserve, right? And so I will always say, I think it's what you do well, Anna. Actually, it's ask questions and seek to understand. Because if something is done very differently than maybe what you're used to, maybe ask why. Hey, just curious, like I noticed that you like to do this, or that you always, like for example, and this is a very simple one, right? Christmas Eve is a huge holiday for us, right? Not Christmas Day, it's Christmas Eve
Yeah.
for us.
Yep. Very true.
Why, right? Ask somebody why.
Mhm.
Don't be all of a
Yeah.
sudden like, that's weird, why wouldn't you celebrate Christmas? It's ask, and honestly, most people may not even be able to give you an answer as to the origins of the why, but they'll just tell you, this is just what my family has always
Yeah.
celebrated. And then you
Mm,
can get a glimpse into people's traditions and into people's lives, and understand them. And so I think that's the best way that you can love someone well, is not make an assumption, but ask a question that's seeking to understand, not to verify a judgment.
mm.
Mhm.
Important
So
distinction.
good.
And I love that you noted this because it's actually one of the most common threads as when we think about loving people from different backgrounds. It's the assumption piece. And it's just fascinating to me. I'm like, again and again, it's confirmed. I think one of the biggest things and it can be like as we see culture from like this is majority culture and this is other cultures, like the US is
Mhm.
so rich in cultures and backgrounds,
Mhm.
right? So the majority culture, it can be very tempting to other, right, to
Mhm. Mhm.
say because it's different it's bad or it's wrong. No,
Mhm.
it's different, and let's stay curious about it and not
Mhm.
judge it, because
Right.
Right.
it's our human nature to
Mhm.
judge. I mean, I do it in other ways.
Yeah.
So it's just our nature, but it's like when we're met with this, how can we stay curious and stay open to ask. So thank you for sharing that, because it's just something that we keep circling back, and I'm like, hey, it's something that we can look from the outside, as we are in American culture, we are here,
Mhm.
what is and what ways can we just see it from a different perspective, not othering, not judging it,
Right.
And
but
I just want to say
saying, yeah,
too, on top of that, Marlon, real quick, like it's also interesting that we've had that common thread with everyone that has been on the show, or that has been on this podcast, but also that has been from all around the world. It has not been one
yeah,
geographic region that has said it. It has been
Mm-mm.
literally every single person pretty much that has been
yep,
on on these episodes. So that
yep,
just goes to show, as humans, like you're saying, Marlon, we just need to do better about asking questions and being curious to get to know each other before just making assumptions in general, like on
Mhm.
yep,
all sides. I think
yep,
that's what's so interesting is like that is our human nature, is to judge, but yet how different would it be, Jess, if I was like, oh wow, you celebrate Christmas Eve? Like, tell me more about that. What does that look like?
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, versus like,
Yeah.
oh, that's strange. Why would you do that?
That's
You
weird.
know?
Yeah.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah,
Major
that's just
difference.
in
Major
general
difference.
conversation, I feel like we can all gain
Yeah.
and really do
Mhm.
better in that area. Well, thank you so
Mhm.
much for being on the podcast. I love that you were able to come on and share your story and just share so much insight into what you've learned and what you've walked through, and how you've really just been an example. I know we didn't get into a lot of faith driven stuff, but man, we will have to have you back on so that you can really just speak some truth, because I know you have it in you. And I'm sure we'll have to reconnect on another episode. But for now, if you guys haven't listened to our last episode, make sure you go check that one out, and we will catch you on the next episode. Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye.